who truly owns the soil. In the heart of South Central Los Angeles, specifically within the gridlocked avenues of Watts, a peculiar and lethal contradiction governs the pavement. To a casual observer, the graffiti-etched walls and the young men standing sentinel on the corners of 112th Street represent a claim of absolute ownership. These individuals, often members of the Bounty Hunter Bloods or various Crips sets, speak of the neighborhood with a possessive ferocity. They refer to the soil as their own, a piece of the earth they are prepared to defend with a level of violence that defies standard logic. Yet, a search of the Los Angeles County Registrar Recorder's office reveals a chilling statistical reality. Almost none of the men bleeding for these blocks hold the deed to a single square inch of them. The land is owned by the City of Los Angeles Housing Authority, absentee landlords residing in the hills of Calabasas, or institutional developers waiting for the precise moment of demographic shift. This is the central paradox of the American ghetto, a multi-generational war fought over the right to control territory that the combatants are statistically destined to be evicted from. The mechanics of this struggle are not rooted in mindless chaos, but in a sophisticated, informal economy that operates parallel to the legal world. In the American street system, this set functions as a localized paramilitary corporation. Its primary objective is not merely the sale of illicit substances, but the enforcement of territorial sovereignty. This sovereignty allows the set to levy taxes, regulate commerce, and provide a brutal form of stability in a vacuum left by the state. When a soldier stands on the corner of Wilmington Avenue, he is not just selling a product. He is maintaining a physical boundary. That boundary is the collateral for the neighborhood's entire shadow economy. If the boundary falls, the ledger of the street is wiped clean, and the local hierarchy collapses. The tragedy of the American block is that this ledger is written in blood, but the final balance sheet is always settled by the bank. The anatomy of a U.S. gang territory is defined by the rigid mapping of sets and blocks. In places like Watts, the geography is dictated by the massive public housing developments, Nickerson Gardens, Jordan Downs, and Imperial Courts. These are not merely residential clusters. They are the fortified citadels of the street system. The Nickerson Gardens, the ancestral home of the Bounty Hunter Bloods, spans over 50 acres. It is a city within a city, with its own internal laws, currency, and social strata. To understand the American ghetto, one must view these developments as sovereign microstates. The boundaries are as real as any international border, often marked by a change in the color of a fire hydrant, a specific style of graffiti hit up, or the invisible line where one street name ends and another begins. The physical structure of these territories dictates the tactical movements of the participants. The shot caller views the housing project as a defensible asset. The narrow alleyways and high-density apartment blocks provide cover and escape routes that favor the local insurgent over the outside law enforcement officer. This architecture of poverty, originally designed for social uplift in the mid-20th century, has been repurposed into a theater of urban warfare. The block is the fundamental unit of power. Control of the block means control of the gate, the metaphorical entrance through which all commerce must pass. If a set controls the gate, they control the lifeblood of the neighborhood. This is the real estate of the set, a claim to the air and the asphalt, even as the buildings themselves crumble under the weight of municipal neglect. In the first layer of this investigation, we look at the mechanism of territorial taxes. In neighborhoods dominated by established sets like the Bounty Hunter Bloods or the Grape Street Watts Crips, the concept of protection is a formal economic reality. Every legitimate business operating within the set's radius, from the corner bodega to the mobile taco truck, operates under an unspoken agreement. This is gatekeeping. It is a street-level franchise fee. A business owner pays the set not just to avoid being robbed by the set itself, but for the set to ensure no outside, non-affiliated criminals disrupt the peace. It is a protection racket that mimics the insurance industry, though the premiums are collected in cash and the claims are settled with 9mm rounds. The paradox of power here is that the set provides the only reliable security in the area, yet their presence is the primary reason the area is deemed insecure by the outside world. This tax extends to the residents as well. In some high-intensity zones, even the simple act of moving furniture or hosting a social gathering requires a nod from the local shot callers. This is the extraction of social capital. By forcing the community to ask for permission, the set reinforces its status as the de facto government. The harsh reality, however, is that this power is entirely localized and fragile. The set can tax the local laundromat, but they have no power over the municipal zoning boards that are currently recategorizing their territory for mixed-use development. They are masters of a sinking ship, extracting every possible cent from a population that is being slowly squeezed out by rising property values and strategic disinvestment. The consequence is a community that is double taxed, once by the state for services it barely receives, and once by the street for a safety that is inherently violent. Moving deeper into the mechanics of the block, we encounter the trap as an unofficial financial institution. In the absence of traditional banking, where low credit scores and redlining historical baggage prevent residents from accessing capital, the street fills the void. The trap house is more than a distribution point for narcotics. It functions as the neighborhood's lender of last resort. When a mother needs a few $100s for an emergency car repair or a funeral, and the bank doors are closed, she may turn to the set. These are short-term, high-interest loans, often referred to as street juice. There are no credit checks in the Nickerson Gardens. The collateral is your physical presence on the block and the reputation of your family. If the loan is not repaid, the bank does not send a late notice. They send an enforcer. The interest is not calculated in percentages, but in respect and future favors. This creates a cycle of perpetual debt that binds the civilian population to the criminal element. The paradox of the Trappist Bank is that it provides a necessary service to a marginalized community while simultaneously cannibalizing that community's future. It is an economic trap in the most literal sense. The harsh reality is that this informal banking system prevents the accumulation of legitimate generational wealth. Money made in the street rarely moves into the S&P 500. It stays in the street, fueling further cycles of consumption and violence. The consequence is a closed-loop economy where the only way to get ahead is to risk everything, and the only way to stay afloat is to remain tethered to the very structures that are sinking the neighborhood. This brings us to the logic of symbols, the blue and the red. For decades, the rivalry between the Crips and the Bloods has been characterized as a senseless war over colors. But through a sociological lens, these colors are branding. They are the logos of the competing firms. In the 1970s and 80s, as the manufacturing base of Los Angeles eroded and the blue-collar path to the middle class vanished, the set became the only viable employer for many young men. The adoption of a color was an act of corporate branding in a hyper-competitive market for territory. The blue and red ledger is the accounting of who controls which market share. The paradox of the symbol is that the more a soldier identifies with his brand, the more he limits his own mobility. A young man from a blood set in what cannot simply apply for a job in a Crip-dominated part of Long Beach without risking his life. The color he wears for respect and protection acts as a geographical prison. The harsh reality is that these symbols are increasingly irrelevant to the macroeconomics of the city. While the sets are fighting over the blue side or red side of a specific boulevard, the city is approving permits for luxury condos and tech hubs that do not recognize these boundaries. The colors are a distraction from the fact that the map is being redrawn by people who have never set foot on the block. The consequence is a generation of men who are hyper-aware of their local borders but completely blind to the economic forces that are making those borders obsolete. The concept of respect is the final mechanic of the territorial ledger. In the street system, respect is the only currency that doesn't depreciate. It is the social credit of the American ghetto. A man with no money but high respect can command resources, influence others, and survive in the most hostile environments. This respect is earned through work, a euphemism for acts of violence, loyalty, and territorial defense. The cost of this respect, however, is staggering. To maintain it, the individual must constantly demonstrate a willingness to use force. This is the street prison pipeline in its most distilled form. The paradox is that the very actions required to gain respect within the set are the same actions that ensure the individual will spend the majority of their life behind bars. The shot caller who is respected on the block is often a man who has traded 30 years of his freedom for the right to be feared for 5. The harsh reality is that the street's code of respect is a survival mechanism that actually decreases the probability of long-term survival. It creates a vacuum where the most capable and charismatic young men are removed from the community, either by death or incarceration, leaving the soil even more vulnerable to outside exploitation. The consequence is a sociological reset that occurs every 10 to 15 years. As the older generation is cleared out, a younger, more volatile generation takes over, often without the institutional memory or the invisible laws that provided even a modicum of restraint in the past. The unifying theory of the American bloc is the cycle of the soil. The ghetto is not a static place. It is a high-velocity environment where people and capital are constantly being cycled through. The set defends the territory, the state incarcerates the set, the developers wait for the land value to bottom out, and the process begins again. The reason the cycle is nearly impossible to break is that the mechanics of the street are perfectly adapted to the mechanics of the larger economy. The street provides a way for the marginalized to survive in the short term, but only by sacrificing their long-term prospects. The American ghetto, from the south side of Chicago to the projects of Watts, is a masterpiece of unintended consequences. It is a system designed to contain poverty, which in turn created its own internal laws of physics. The blue and red ledger is always balanced at the end of the day, but the profit never goes to the people on the block. It goes to the system that profits from their incarceration, the developers who profit from their displacement, and the industry that profits from the documentation of their struggle. The tragic truth is that the soldiers of the set are fighting for a homeland that is essentially a lease. They are the temporary tenants of a war zone. As we look at the changing skyline of American cities, we see the cranes moving closer to the old territories. The 110 freeway is no longer just a border between sets. It is the path of a new economic reality. The block is changing, not because the war has ended, but because the land has finally become more valuable than the people living on it. If you found this investigation into the real mechanics of the American street insightful, consider supporting the channel by subscribing and liking the video to ensure more deep dives into the untold stories of the block. To understand the true weight of the blue and red ledger, one must look beyond the asphalt of South Central and toward the sterile, concrete corridors of the California Department of Corrections. The American street system does not end at the neighborhood boundary. It extends into a feedback loop that connects the block to the cell block. This is the architecture of incarceration. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the Green Wall, the slang for the prison industrial complex, became the boardroom where the most significant territorial decisions were made. When a high-ranking member of a set like the Rollin' 60s neighborhood Crips is removed from the street and placed in a Level 4 facility like Pelican Bay, he does not lose his influence. Instead, his influence is refined. The prison system acts as a finishing school for the street's upper management. Within the walls, the petty squabbles over a single street corner on Slauson Avenue are traded for a broader, more terrifyingly efficient understanding of power. In prison, the racial and gang-based nations must organize with a level of discipline that is often impossible on the chaotic streets. This creates the prison street pipeline, a mechanism where the invisible laws of the yard are exported back to the neighborhood. When a shot caller sends word from behind the glass, the ledger on the street is adjusted. A peace treaty might be signed between rival blood and Crip sets to facilitate a more efficient supply chain, or a green light might be issued on a specific individual who has violated the code of silence. This leads to the paradox of the invisible law. The more a community is policed, the more it relies on the internal justice of the set. To a 45-year-old homeowner in a neighborhood like Leimert Park, the presence of law enforcement might represent safety, but to the soldier on the corner, the police are merely a competing gang with a larger budget and better legal protection. The no-snitching code is often dismissed by outside observers as a simple refusal to cooperate with authority. In reality, it is a sophisticated risk management strategy. In a territory where the state has lost its monopoly on violence, the only way to ensure personal safety is to remain neutral or loyal to the local power structure. Cooperating with the police is seen as a breach of contract, a violation of the territorial tax agreement, The harsh reality is that the state's inability to protect witnesses has turned no snitching from a criminal choice into a survival necessity. The consequence is a silent neighborhood, where the most brutal crimes go unsolved because the residents know that the police will leave at the end of their shift, but the set remains forever. The mechanics of this power are not limited to Los Angeles. If we shift our focus 2,000 miles east to the south side of Chicago, we see a different but equally lethal application of the ledger. While the LA sets are often defined by the set or the specific housing development, Chicago's history is defined by the nations, the Black P. Stones, the Gangster Disciples, and the Vice Lords. In the mid-20th century, these organizations were more centralized than their West Coast counterparts. They were structured like traditional corporations, with a chairman or a prince overseeing thousands of members. They even attempted to pivot into legitimate political activism during the civil rights era, leveraging their territorial sovereignty to demand city services and social reform. The tragedy of the Chicago model is the decapitation effect. In the 1990s and 2000s, federal law enforcement successfully used conspiracy statutes to remove the top-tier leadership of the Chicago nations. The logic was simple: remove the head and the body will die. However, the sociological result was the opposite. Without a central authority to settle disputes and regulate the ledger, the nation splintered into hundreds of microsets. A conflict that once involved entire sides of the city was replaced by a block-by-block war. In contemporary Chicago, a young man from 63rd and St. Lawrence might be at war with a group from 64th and St. Lawrence. These are fractionalized territories where the historical identity of the nation has been replaced by an intense, localized loyalty to a single patch of pavement. The paradox here is that the removal of organized crime created disorganized chaos, which is far more difficult to survive. In a centralized system, there are rules, protocols, and a clear chain of command. In a fractionalized system, violence is erratic and unpredictable. The harsh reality is that the destruction of gang hierarchies did not make the South Side safer. It merely made the violence more democratic and harder to map. The consequence is a state of perpetual high alert for the residents. When the territory is reduced to a single block, the danger zone is everywhere. A wrong turn on a bike or a transit stop at the wrong intersection can be a death sentence, not because of a grand strategic war, but because of a personal grievance between two teenagers who have inherited a ledger they didn't even write. This brings us to the concept of the generational reset. In the American ghetto, the life expectancy of a territorial claim is roughly 15 years. This coincides with the length of a standard federal prison sentence or the time it takes for a new generation to reach fighting age. When a set is cleaned out by a major law enforcement sweep, the neighborhood experiences a brief period of quiet. To the outside world, it looks like a victory. To the sociologist, it is the clearing of the forest floor to allow for new, more aggressive growth. The new generation that emerges from this reset is often more disconnected from the invisible laws than their predecessors. They haven't seen the peace treaties of the 90s. They only know the respect earned through the digital currency of social media. This is the technology of the set. In the modern era, the blue and red ledger is no longer kept in private notebooks or whispered in alleyways. It is broadcast on Instagram Live and YouTube. Diss tracks have replaced the graffiti hit-up as the primary method of challenging territorial sovereignty. A teenager in a housing project can now insult a rival set to a global audience in real time. The paradox of digital territory is that it makes the physical world more dangerous. A digital insult requires a physical response to maintain the set's brand value. The harsh reality is that social media has accelerated the cycle of violence, turning localized disputes into viral spectacles that demand a blood sacrifice. The consequence is that the shot callers of the past, who might have exercised restraint for the sake of profit, have been replaced by the clout chasers of the present, who prioritize digital engagement over territorial stability. The ledger is now being balanced in likes, shares, and casualties. Beneath this digital layer, the street economics remain as cold and mathematical as ever. We must analyze the interstate supply chain, the logistics that turn a local block into a high-revenue asset. Most major American ghettos are strategically located near major transit hubs. South Central LA is bordered by the I-10 and the I-110. The south side of Chicago is bisected by the Dan Ryan Expressway. These are not just roads for the commuting public. They are the arteries of the shadow economy. The territory is valuable precisely because it is accessible. A trap located near a highway off-ramp has a much higher valuation than one buried in the center of a residential zone. This is because the customer base for the street's products is not the local population, who are often too impoverished to sustain the market, but the commuter from the affluent suburbs. The paradox of the American ghetto is that it serves as a service hub for the very society that seeks to wall it off. The suburban demand for illicit substances is the engine that drives the territorial wars of the inner city. The soldier on the block is merely the retail clerk for a global industry. The harsh reality is that the war on drugs has never been a war on the product. It has been a war on the retail space. By criminalizing the territory, the state ensures that the profit margins remain high enough to justify the risk of death or prison. The consequence is a permanent service class of young men who are used as disposable labor in a high-stakes logistics game. When one clerk is arrested, another is hired from the waiting list of the unemployed and the dispossessed. The ledger never stays empty for long. The final layer of this investigation is the gentrification endgame. As we move into the mid-2020s, the maps of Los Angeles and Chicago are being rewritten by forces far more powerful than the Bloods or the Crips. This is eminent domain and market realignment. In neighborhoods that were once considered no-go zones, new coffee shops and tech lofts are appearing. This is not a sign that the social problems have been solved. It is a sign that the land has been reclaimed. The paradox of gentrification is that the fear generated by the sets actually kept the land prices low enough for the original residents to stay. Once the sets are dismantled and the stigma of the neighborhood is removed, the residents, the mothers, the grandfathers, the legitimate small business owners, are the first to be priced out. The soil that the soldiers died for is finally sold to the highest bidder. The harsh reality is that the territorial war was a holding action for a property owner who didn't even know the soldiers' names. The blue and red ledger is ultimately closed by a notary public and a real estate agent. The consequence is the displacement of the block. The culture, the history, and the pain of the neighborhood are sanitized and sold as urban grit to a new demographic. The former residents are pushed further into the Inland Empire or the outer ring suburbs, where the infrastructure of the street begins to reform in even more isolated and desperate conditions. The cycle does not end. It merely moves to a different coordinate on the map. This internal migration leads to the final, most opaque layer of the street's economic structure, the laundering of the block. In the corporate world, profit is reinvested to grow the enterprise. In the street system of the American ghetto, profit is a liability. A shot caller in a set like the Bounty Hunter Bloods or the Hoover Criminals faces a unique problem. The more successful his business becomes, the more difficult it is to keep the proceeds within the neighborhood. Because the soil is not owned by the participants, there is no way to legally store or grow capital. One cannot use drug proceeds to repair the local park or upgrade the electrical grid of a public housing project without attracting federal scrutiny. Consequently, the money flows outward. The paradox of the trap is that it is an engine of wealth extraction, not wealth creation. The millions of dollars generated on the corners of South Central or the south side of Chicago are spent on depreciating assets, high-end vehicles, jewelry, and luxury clothing, or they are laundered through cash-heavy businesses in other parts of the city. The harsh reality is that the block is an economic sieve. The very activities that the soldiers die for ensure that the neighborhood remains in a state of permanent financial depletion. The set is not a community organization. It is a colonial outpost for a shadow economy that feeds on the neighborhood's desperation and then exports the profit. The consequence is a frozen landscape. Even as the world around it evolves, the block stays the same, dilapidated, underfunded, and dangerous, because its only source of capital is illegal and therefore uninvestable. The unifying theory of the American ghetto suggests that the cycle of the streets is not a failure of the system, but a byproduct of its design. The ghetto functions as a laboratory of raw capitalism, stripped of the protections and safety nets afforded to the middle class. In this environment, the set is a logical response to a lack of state-sponsored order. When the formal economy excludes a specific demographic, an informal economy will inevitably rise to take its place. This informal economy requires its own military to protect its real estate. The Bloods, the Crips, and the Chicago Nations are the result of a population trying to create a structure of power where none was provided. However, this structure is built on a fundamental lie. The soil that the soldier claims as his own is a mirage. The blue and red ledger is a document of ownership for a property that is already spoken for by the city's master plan. The war for the block is a war for a lease that has already expired. The unifying truth is that the American ghetto is a temporary holding zone. It is a space where the surplus population of the industrial era is managed and contained until the land becomes valuable enough for a different use. The territory is a distraction, a game of king of the hill played on a mountain that is being leveled by a bulldozer. The cycle is nearly impossible to break because it is self-reinforcing. The violence of the street justifies the heavy policing. The heavy policing leads to high incarceration rates. The high incarceration rates destroy the family structure. The destroyed family structure produces a new generation of soldiers seeking a sense of belonging and power within the set. This is the social reset. Every 20 years, the names of the shot callers change, the slang evolves, and the technology shifts, but the underlying mechanics remain. The trap stays open, the gate remains guarded, and the ledger continues to be written in the same red and blue ink. The harsh reality of the American block is that respect is the only thing a man can truly own, but it is the one thing he cannot leave to his children. A father's status in a set does not grant his son a better life. It usually grants him a target on his back. Generational wealth is built on deeds, titles, and compounding interest, things that do not exist in the shadow of the projects. The soldiers of the American street are fighting for the right to be the masters of a vanishing world. They are the guardians of a ruins, defending a territory that has already been sold out from under them. In the final analysis, the blue and red ledger is not a record of power, but a record of loss. It is a mathematical proof that in the game of the American streets, the house always wins. The house, in this case, is not the rival set or the police department. It is the broader economic machine that profits from the chaos. While the sets are focused on the frontage of the block, the macroeconomics are focused on the deed. The soil will eventually be reclaimed, the buildings will be demolished, and the history of the struggle will be paved over with a new layer of asphalt. Why does the block never change? Perhaps because it was never meant to. It was meant to function as it does, as a pressure cooker, a retail space, and a warehouse for the marginalized. To change the block would be to dismantle an entire sector of the American economy that relies on the trap-to-prison pipeline. Until the fundamental mathematics of the soil are addressed, until the residents own the deeds to their homes and the capital stays within the community, the ledger will never be closed. The war will continue over the same few square miles, fought by young men who believe they are kings of a territory that is actually a prison without bars. As the sun sets over the Nickerson Gardens or the streets of Englewood, the silhouettes on the corner remain. They are the sentinels of the ledger, waiting for the next transaction, the next challenge, and the next cycle. They speak of loyalty and soil, unaware that the very ground they stand on is moving beneath their feet. The American ghetto is a story of profound survival and profound tragedy. A place where the human spirit is forced into the most brutal of shapes just to endure another night on the block. If you value these deep investigations into the systemic realities of the American streets, consider joining our community by subscribing and liking the video. Your support allows us to continue documenting the unspoken laws of the block. To fully grasp the blue and red ledger, one must examine the role of the lookout, the entry-level position in the street's human resources department. In the high-density environment of the Imperial Courts or Jordan Downs, surveillance is not just the domain of the police. The set maintains its own sophisticated, low-tech intelligence network. Young boys on bicycles, elderly residents sitting on porches, and even the fiends who frequent the alleys are recruited as the eyes and ears of the organization. This is a payroll of necessity. The cost of maintaining this human perimeter is a significant line item in the street's budget. It is a primitive but effective early warning system that negates the advantage of high-tech police surveillance. When a black and white patrol car turns onto 103rd Street, the information travels through the block faster than a radio signal. The paradox of the lookout system is that it turns the entire community into a participant in the shadow economy, whether they wish to be or not. By accepting a small payment or a favor in exchange for information, a civilian becomes an asset of the set. This blurs the line between the criminal and the community, making it nearly impossible for outside social services to operate without the set's tacit approval. The harsh reality is that the set provides more consistent employment for the neighborhood's youth than any municipal summer job program. The consequence is a normalization of the lookout role, where the first lesson a child learns about the economy is that silence and observation are the most marketable skills they possess. This leads to the mechanics of the program, the formalization of street law that occurred after the 1992 Los Angeles riots. In the aftermath of that civil unrest, there was a temporary truce between many Blood and Crips sets. For a brief moment, the ledger was put aside in favor of a unified front against systemic issues. However, this truce revealed a terrifying sociological truth. The war was the only thing keeping the street's economy regulated. Without the territorial competition, the market for illicit services became oversaturated. Prices dropped, discipline eroded, and the internal hierarchies began to collapse. The paradox of the peace treaty is that while it reduced the murder rate, it also destabilized the street's power structure. Without a common enemy in the rival set, the younger members began to challenge the older shot callers for control of the gate. The harsh reality is that the street system requires conflict to maintain its internal order. The war provides a justification for the set's existence and a mechanism for promoting its most aggressive and loyal members. The consequence was a return to violence that was even more fractured and localized than before. The 1992 truce proved that the American ghetto is not a monolithic entity that can be solved with a handshake. It is a complex ecosystem that has adapted to thrive on its own volatility. We must also analyze the cleaning of the cash, the process by which the street's profits are laundered through the very infrastructure of the neighborhood. In South Central LA, the proliferation of cash-heavy businesses like car washes, swap meets, and independent laundromats is not accidental. These businesses serve as the frontage for the ledger. A car wash on Central Avenue may process 50 cars a day but report the income of 500. This allows the set to move dirty money into the legitimate banking system, where it can be used to pay for legal defense, high-end real estate outside the zone, or to seed new trap locations. The paradox of the front business is that it provides a legitimate service to the community while simultaneously facilitating the activities that degrade it. The car wash provides jobs and a clean car for the working-class resident, but its primary function is to serve the interests of the shot caller. The harsh reality is that these businesses are often the only successful enterprises in the neighborhood, creating a perverse dependency. The community relies on the front for services, while the front relies on the criminal activity to remain solvent. The consequence is an entrenched economy, where the legitimate and the illegitimate are so deeply intertwined that one cannot be removed without collapsing the other. The unifying theory of the American bloc finally concludes that the soil is a mechanism of containment. The physical geography of the ghetto, the dead-end streets, the massive housing developments, and the lack of reliable public transit is designed to keep the cycle internal. The violence stays on the block. The money leaves the block. The people are replaced on the block. The blue and red ledger is the accounting system for this containment. It ensures that the residents are so focused on the life and death struggle for the next 100 yards of pavement that they never look up to see the developers' cranes on the horizon. The cycle of the U.S. streets is nearly impossible to break because it is the only system that offers a sense of agency to the dispossessed. In a world that tells a young man he has no value, the set tells him he is a soldier. In a world that tells him he has no future, the trap offers him a paycheck today. The invisible laws provide a sense of justice, however brutal, in a landscape where the legal system is seen as an occupying force. The tragedy is that this agency is a trap in itself. It is a choice between two forms of nothingness: the nothingness of being ignored by the state, or the nothingness of being destroyed by the street. The outro of this investigation leaves us with a chilling philosophical reflection. When we look at the history of the Bloods and the Crips, or the evolution of the Chicago Nations, we are not looking at a story of crime. We are looking at a story of territory in its most primal form. Humans have always fought for land, for resources, and for respect. The American ghetto is simply the most modern and most compressed version of this ancient struggle. The tragedy is not that these men are fighting. The tragedy is that they are fighting for land they do not own and for a respect that dies with them on the pavement. The soil of South Central will eventually be turned over. The housing projects will be demolished to make way for urban renewals and innovation districts. The graffiti will be sandblasted away, and the memory of the sets will be relegated to documentaries and history books. But the ledger will simply move to a new location. As long as there is a surplus population and a lack of ownership, the block will continue to exist under a different name and a different color. The question is not how to end the war, but how to change the ownership of the soil. Until the people on the block hold the deeds to the land, they will always be soldiers in someone else's army, fighting for a territory that was never theirs to keep. If you are interested in the deep sociology of the American street and the hidden mechanics of the urban landscape, please consider subscribing to Tales from the Block and liking this video to help us bring more of these investigative narratives to light.